Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Access Minnesota brings you the newsmakers and the stories that shape our everyday lives, with analysis from University of Minnesota faculty experts. Now, here's Jim Dubois.
Some Republican and Democratic lawmakers in Minnesota are calling for an end to the long-standing trade embargo between the U.S. and Cuba. While it may appear strange on the surface that a landlocked state in the north is taking such an interest in a small and historically controversial Caribbean country, restoring trade with Cuba could lead to big opportunities for Minnesota businesses. This month on Access Minnesota, we talk with Chuck Slocum, president of the management consulting firm the Williston Group, about why Minnesota businesses in particular can benefit from a trade agreement between the U.S. and Cuba. Chuck Slocum is president of the Williston Group. It's a management consulting firm. Chuck visited Cuba in 2015. Chuck, welcome to Access Minnesota.
Well, fine. Nice to be here.
Prominent Minnesota politicians have taken the lead in efforts to open relations with Cuba. Representative Colin Peterson, for example, authored a bill some time ago that would allow Americans to travel to Cuba. Both Representative Tom Emmer and Senator Amy Klobuchar are sponsoring legislation to ease economic restrictions on the island nation. For a landlocked state here in the northern part of the U.S., why do you think Minnesota's leaders have taken such a keen interest in U.S.-Cuban relations?
That's a great question, and I really hadn't thought about that question until I actually went there and did some homework. First of all, we're a center of intellectual curiosity. The Humphrey Institute's been looking at these kinds of issues, as well as other colleges and scholars. Secondly, we are a global center in the middle of America, and our country, we have 30 companies that are on one or the other of the Fortune 500 list, services or manufacturing. And so those companies have a fairly sophisticated view of world commerce. And, I think our political leaders, and frankly, political leaders in the Midwest and the West are almost unanimous. And I think all 10, both senators and all 8 members of Congress in Minnesota, I know that 2 of them have told me, since I wrote that piece recently in the newspaper, have told me that next time you do one, make sure you mention that I'm also supportive of repealing this embargo. And let's just talk about that embargo a second, because that's been going on since really essentially 1960. We started figuring out ways to kind of punish Fidel Castro. And what's worked out is Fidel Castro and his brother Raul have survived and created a fairly strong political machine in Cuba, but its people are worse off now than they were before. And so if our intent was to try to bring that government down and elevate the lifestyle and the quality of life for people, it's been a failure. Our embargo's been a failure. However, fixing it is going to be a challenge.
What industries in Minnesota would benefit the most from ending the embargo?
Well, two come to mind. The technology industry, because Minnesota has technology companies and they're at cutting edge medical technology, et cetera. And Cuba needs that kind of help. And those companies, if they could find buying customers in Cuba, they would prosper. I mean, they would gain business for sure. But 80% of the food that Cubans eat is imported, which is a terrible thing to happen to any country when you can't sustain your own people. And we have agricultural companies, Schwann's, for example, Cargill for sure, who have been active in trying to get our federal government to re-examine this embargo and to normalize relations with Cuba.
Is it fair to say that the majority of Minnesota businesses, at least the ones with which you are familiar, are in favor of ending the embargo?
I don't think Minnesotans go around thinking, by golly, we've got to really punish Fidel Castro some 56 years after he took power. I think we're just generally, we've been ignorant because we've been prohibited to learn too much and have commerce there and go there. And Cubans know little about America because, as one cab driver told me who was a Cuban, he said privately, he said, you know, we love America, he said, but this island is a prison. to many of us. We can't get out. We don't have this global view. And of course, we haven't, until recently, been able to go to Cuba and really learn very much. I know you recently have been to Cuba too, and so you and I can compare notes.
How would the Cubans benefit from trade with Minnesota?
Well, anything that would raise the average income of Cubans, business, investments, would be something that they would welcome. They view Americans, of course, as the country on the that they look to. As most average Cubans have a Reagan-esque view of America, that we're a wonderful place. But it's politically been not acceptable to talk about markets or entrepreneurism or capitalism. Those words are not part of the revolutionary government's vernacular. And so they haven't studied that kind of stuff. And they don't have a lot of assets other than friendly, warm people, almost all of whom are literate in Spanish. They can read and write Spanish. But their economy is dead. It is not a growing, bustling thing. There is virtually no private investment in there. And that's what Cuba needs for the average wage or the average income of a Cuban to go up. It's $20 a month now is the average. And that's up from $15 a couple of years ago, but nobody lives on $20 a month, or few people do.
Are there any economic downsides to opening up trade with Cuba, or are the criticisms about ending the embargo mainly based on political issues?
I think they're based on political issues, and they're based on Florida politics, because of the 2 million Cubans in America, 70% of them live in Florida, and they're politically connected, and many of them very successful in business, who lost family members or are still looking for family members, who've been blocked from getting back to Cuba until very, very recently. And so it's basically political. I think Congress, with the work of Congressman Emmer and Senator Klobuchar now on this embargo stuff, and like I said, I think almost all of the Midwestern, I think there would be great support to begin again. And I think basically if this was an experiment to try to help the Cuban people by putting together a fairly complicated, thorough embargo, if that was the idea, was to help the Cuban people, which I like to think it was, it hasn't worked.
When Access Minnesota returns, we'll hear about Chuck Slocum's trip to Cuba and why travel restrictions for Americans who wish to visit the island nation may soon be eased.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages. You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Now back to our conversation with Williston Group President Chuck Slocum about his recent trip to Cuba and the economic opportunities the country holds for Minnesota. Tell us about your trip to Cuba. You traveled there in December of this past year. How did you go about getting permission to travel to Cuba?
We worked with an agency, a 2-year-old agency that came together under the recent rules. The Obama administration has been relaxing some of these rules to encourage more Americans to get there. And of course, we went as a group that was studying cultural and educational issues, and we were all from business virtually, or most from business. And they handled, the outfit was In Touch Cuba. They handled all relations with the State Department to clear the way for us, as well as with the Cuban government to make arrangements for us to see a good bit of that country in 10 days.
Why did you personally decide to travel to Cuba?
I'm like many people, I'm just curious. I grew up with this concept of Fidel Castro in Cuba and the communists, and they were really our enemies. But when you look at it, it's preposterous to think that our economy can be greatly affected by Cubans. But Cuba's economy, when we pulled our sugar purchases from their sugar cane out, they went hunting for finding someone that would buy their sugar cane. Eventually Russia came through, and Russia became 80% of their economy for 30 years. It was the largest foreign affairs investment, largest aid to a country ever in the history. When 80% of a country's economy is paid for by one other country, that's a huge huge investment. But that allowed Castro to do the bidding of the communist world in Latin America and in South America, and of course that irritated the heck out of America.
With the collapse of the Soviet bloc in the late 1980s, there was a devastating impact on the Cuban economy. The Cubans almost euphemistically refer to it as the special period, but that was a time when Cubans were literally almost hungry. What impact did that period have on Cuba?
Well, it was a shock to most of them, because the reason that it failed, the reason that they went into these hard times, was that Gorbachev said, I'm not going to be in the spend game and build Star Wars like President Reagan's doing in America. And they were convinced that unless they put an end to it, that, and part of putting an end to this spending and investment in Cold War stuff meant they couldn't be Cuba's sugar daddy anymore. So it really came down to money, and the people were hungry. The people didn't. People did have primary health care. Castro did some very strong things early on. One was to try to build up their healthcare system and train doctors. And if you were really smart, and if you were picked at age 13 to go on and to be a doctor and you got trained, they have a system now throughout the country that anybody without money in their pocket can get in and see someone right now about many diseases. And so people always have had that, or have had that essentially since the 60s. And that's a real asset for the average person. And they also have an ability, the climate is good, and they have ability to have relatively cheap housing, and people can find a place to live. But as far as having sufficient and healthy food, and as far as having the ability to sustain to grow a family and to sustain them and have a decent standard of living, very, very few Cubans have that, unless you're in the government. And many people in the government are part of the political infrastructure that's been developed over the last 50 years.
Tell us about some of the places you traveled in Cuba and what impressed you the most.
Well, I'm a history buff, so I was most impressed with the Bay of Pigs, where I got to go out in the bay and got to stand there, and then there was a museum adjacent to that. Interestingly, their heroes, of course, are the 20 or 25 Cubans who died on the Bay of Pigs. And they, of course, call it the invasion. The invasion, they didn't say the invasion from America, but they are North American foe or something. There was a vague reference, but they rarely used United States or America in any of their stuff. The Bay of Pigs was fascinating because I learned just how confused things were when you transferred from President Eisenhower to President Kennedy, when we already knew that this Castro guy was probably going in directions we didn't like. We were, and there were hundreds and hundreds of Cubans who were willing to try to get back into power. They'd left the country as exiles. Their lives were in danger. And we trained them up, our Marines trained them up. We brought in air cover and we did this big plan. And then when we backed out at the last minute and allowed these 1,600 people to come in the shores at the Bay of Pigs where I was standing, 100 of them were killed outright, and I think 400 of them escaped, and the rest of them were captured and were put in pretty brutal prisons and stuff.
Now, you were with a guide for most of your trip through Cuba, but were you also allowed to go out on your own, and were there any restrictions on where you could go or what you could photograph?
I think by the way that they moved us around the country, there were some restrictions. You know, I raised my hand and said, well, can't we go out to Guantanamo? And they just said, no, you know, we're not going to be anywhere near there. But if you wanted to opt out of an activity that was planned, you could do that and you could go out and walk. You just got to make sure that you know where your hotel is or where your room is. We stayed in some homes and we stayed in some hotels. And no, we didn't have, nobody ever said you can't do that, no. Because they were in the tourism business. They're trying to do things that support us and meet our needs and our interests. They want us to come back, and so it wasn't that way. And even we had a Cuban from the Tourism Bureau who was a government employee travel with us. And I never felt any intimidation or anything like that. I think he was basically watching what people said to us. You know, the people we had hired to show us around and talk to us. He was obviously, he could speak English and understand English.
How prevalent was the Cuban propaganda? Were there billboards glorifying the revolution? What did the guides say? Did they refer to the revolution?
Not really. I mean, we would sometimes ask about the revolution, but there wasn't a lot of talk that they initiated about 1959 in Cuba, except when we were at the Bay of Pigs or when we were at the Cuban Missile Museum, which is an outdoor museum where you see some of those missiles and stuff where the nuclear weapons were removed. Cuba is really Havana and then everything else. Havana is 2.2 million, and I didn't notice it much visible. One of the things you notice is there's Che Guevara, who wasn't actually a Cuban but was involved in the revolution in the 1950s. Che Guevara was the hero. He's the movement hero, the revolution hero, and you can buy his likeness on buttons and shirts and all that, and it's sold elsewhere. And people kind of cheer about Che, and we even see it in America. Castro apparently doesn't want that to happen for him because he's still alive and he doesn't want to be a martyr, etc.
When Access Minnesota returns, we'll hear more about Chuck Slocum's experiences in Cuba.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages. You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Now here's more of our look at how improved relations with Cuba may be a boon to the state's economy. What was your general impression of the economic and social conditions in Cuba?
I think, you know, it is desperate for most Cubans. It's the hopelessness of it. The system is broken, if it ever worked, and so they're struggling. The lack of money for basic necessities, the inability, people don't own cars. But one of the things Cubans have developed is this inventiveness to repair the old cars. And, you know, 40% of their cars are 1960 or older, and they're up and running. Americans would have thrown those cars in the ash heap many, many years ago, but they keep them running. There's kind of a cottage industry that can repair things. And so there's an inventiveness there. But the average Cuban, while a happy person, I think, and they're very musical, and they've developed in the last 50 or 60 years their own kind of form of art, which was interesting to me. But the average Cuban would welcome American engagement with us from a business standpoint. But I think Americans want to do something that will help the average Cuban, and their political system, their economic system, offers very little to invest in. So we'd have to come in as a turnkey. We would have to provide the training, we would have to provide the infrastructure development, and, you know, there wouldn't be a lot of incentives that the Cuban government can provide to an outside partner in commerce and industry.
Now, the Cubans refer to the 1950s vintage U.S. cars as Yank tanks. And some of them, as you said, are in pristine conditions, others not so much. Does it seem to you that it's almost a time warp to go back to Cuba, that you're feeling like you're back in the 1950s to some extent?
And in fact, there's been almost no improvements to the buildings and infrastructure and roads since the 50s. And many of those buildings are closed and just boarded up. And you can see that some of those buildings, I saw a building that was built in the 1500s by the Spanish. They've got a rich history. And you know, they haven't been able to afford to keep those things up, so they repurpose them. A lot of these clinics that I mentioned, these neighborhood clinics, are in those kind of buildings. Homes that were big homes for people that were upper crust in Cuba in the 50s. So they've got a lot of work to do.
Do you have any predictions on what Cuba might look like a decade from now?
No wiser than anybody else's. I would like to think that the average Cuban could have a better life. I would like to think that the notion of individual liberty would be more part of their culture, because it doesn't exist now. And I would like to think that Americans could look at Cuba as an ally and a partner in this part of the world in some way. But and that's what I hope. That's what I hope happens. I think it's going to take years and years. It's probably going to be 20 or 30 years, but we can get there. A lot of it centers on the 2018 elections that they're going to call. They've promised to have free and open elections. We'll see. Of course, there'll be no Castro on the ballot. And so that election, as well as their ability to redo their constitution. And if they can do that in a way that's kind of simpatico with American interests, that would also encourage it. And that could be relatively short term. That would be in the next 2 years. That could some good things could happen. And of course, every day we read about certain things that are making it easier for us to go to Cuba or invest in Cuba or somehow learn more about our neighbor down in the Caribbean.
There's a growing tourism industry in Cuba. More and more people are visiting the country to actually enjoy the beaches, to see the historic sites, to just enjoy the climate. How can the Cuban infrastructure handle a large influx of foreign tourists? We know that the number of what would qualify as a 4-star hotel in the U.S. are pretty minimal. There's only a few of them in Cuba. How would they ever make it possible for a massive influx of tourists given the current restrictions they have on their infrastructure?
Well, the only way to do that is to bring investors in. Now, the tourism industry is big in Asia. There are huge development organizations based out of Taiwan, based out of all sorts of countries. So those countries could look upon Cuba as a destination. Right now, my answer would be I don't think Cuba can afford many more. We set a record last year when you and I were there. I think they had 150,000 Americans visited at least for a day. Sometimes people come down in a ship and they go in for a day and leave. They keep track of those kind of things. Their goal is to have 1.5 million tourists a year would come and spend time there. Well, they're in no way prepared to do that right now. And so it will take outside investment and people with savvy, and they'll be there if the market's there. I believe people would invest there and create the kind of lovely tourist places that we need to do. And Cubans are pretty inventive too. They'll figure out ways to make some of their stuff that's been sitting around for a long time, make that interesting. They do have a more interesting story and history than other Caribbean nations, in my opinion. I've been to 7 or 8 other islands, and this one really has a story. But part of that is because of that American conflict.
The collapse of the Soviet bloc back in the late 1980s created huge economic issues for Cuba, since Cuba had basically been supported by the Soviet Union for several decades. Do you see any other country coming in potentially to fill that void? And one country that comes to mind immediately is China. China certainly is trading with Cuba. The tour buses we were on were Chinese manufacture. Do you think that China would have any vested interest in becoming more involved with Cuba?
Well, when you first asked the question and didn't say China, I thought of Venezuela, but things have changed in Venezuela. Hugo Chavez, of course, gave them an oil refinery, and now Venezuela's thinking of ending that relationship. But China is also market-based, and if China sees opportunities, I think that they could be a partner. And I think Americans could be a partner, and Europeans. There were numbers of Europeans, lots of European tourists that come in, from Germany particularly, I think.
Chuck Slocum is the president of the Williston Group. It's a management consulting firm, and Chuck recently traveled to Cuba in December of 2015. Chuck, thanks so much for joining us on Access Minnesota.
It's nice to be here. Thank you.
That's all for this month's edition of Access Minnesota. We'll see you again next month. Thanks for watching.
Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Join us again next week as we bring you the newsmakers and stories that shape our everyday lives. Access Minnesota is produced by the Minnesota Broadcasters Association in cooperation with the University of Minnesota's College of Liberal Arts.